William McKenna moved slowly along the barely visible trail, carved through snowdrifts a week earlier. Snow had been falling all day, and the path was gradually being buried beneath fresh powder. He regulated his breathing to maintain rhythm. Inhale through the scarf, slow exhale into the frigid air. In the wilderness, such a simple habit conserved energy and protected health, hardening the lungs and preventing cold from settling in the chest. The crunch of steps underfoot echoed rhythmically in the dense silence of the forest. It seemed that every pine, every towering spruce was listening to his footsteps, weighing whether he was stranger or kin. William was no stranger to these woods. Half his life had passed among these trees, in a cabin at the winter station where he'd moved after his wife's death. His son had grown up and moved to Vancouver, and at some point William realized that the only place where he could feel any sense of purpose was this wilderness refuge, where nothing human distracted from what mattered most, the breathing of the forest and his own heart. Evening was falling fast. The gray haze between tree trunks was gradually thickening into dense, viscous darkness. William quickened his pace. He needed to follow the river bend and return to the cabin before complete darkness fell. The blizzard was intensifying. With each gust of wind, the air filled with swirling snow, as if thousands of needles were scratching his cheeks. The ranger habitually covered his face with his mitten, but his eyes still watered from the wind. He stopped to catch his breath and listened to the surrounding emptiness. But silence in the wilderness is never complete. In a blizzard, it's especially distinct. Everything around seemed to speak in its own language. The creaking of pine tops, the grinding of invisible branches, the crackling of ice crust on rocks. Somewhere an owl cried, but its voice was immediately swallowed by the howling wind. "Shouldn't have come out today," he muttered under his breath. His voice sounded muffled, reflected off the scarf, and settled as fog on his mustache. Strength was failing faster than he'd calculated. His feet sank heavily into the crust. Breathing became labored. He took several more steps and suddenly felt the ground give way beneath his feet. No, he hadn't fallen into a hole or stumbled over a root. His body simply refused to obey, as if muscles and bones had suddenly decided they'd had enough. A whitish veil floated before his eyes. The last thing he saw was a whirlwind of snow spinning around his face, falling directly on his eyelashes and turning the world into an endless white spot. William tried to take another step, but his knees buckled and he collapsed straight into a snowdrift. Snow instantly embraced him, cool and sticky, but strangely cozy, like a pillow. Consciousness faded. When he came to, some time had passed. How much exactly was impossible to judge. In the forest, night and day and winter differ only by the shade of darkness. At first, William didn't understand why he felt warm. It seemed someone nearby was breathing, warming his face. He struggled to raise his head and unstick his eyelids. Against the backdrop of the blizzard's chaos, he saw a silhouette. Low, lithe, powerful. A wolf. Her eyes flashed with yellow flame when the moon momentarily pierced through the cloudy vortex. William froze. Everything happened too quickly. Simultaneously fear, surprise, cold reason, and a strange sense of safety constricted his chest. The she-wolf stood very close. At her paws, several dark lumps were fussing, wolf cubs. They whimpered, pressed against their mother, but at the same time curiously reached toward the motionless human lying in the snow. William tried to move. His body obeyed with difficulty. The she-wolf stepped forward, crouched as if preparing to leap. But instead of a growl came deep, quiet breathing, barely audible against the blizzard. He closed his eyes and lost consciousness again. He dreamed he was a child, and his mother was leaning over him, adjusting the warm blanket. In this dream, there was no cold, only breathing and softness. When he opened his eyes again, he saw the same thing before him. The she-wolf lay nearby, pressing her cubs to herself. One of the cubs had almost collapsed onto William's shoulder, its warm nose buried in the collar of his jacket. "Good Lord," he whispered, but didn't move so as not to frighten them. Some strength returned. He tried to get up, but was forced to lie back down in the snow. His body trembled like an old man's. The night seemed endless. The ranger drifted in and out of consciousness. The she-wolf didn't leave all this time. Only at certain moments would she raise her head, listen to the wind, then lay it back down, warming her children and inadvertently warming another living body. When the snowfall subsided, true silence came. Real wilderness silence, muffled and dense, as if the air had become viscous. The ranger reached out to the hard crust of ice, melted by the animal's breath. He leaned on it, raised himself up. A short distance away, he saw a familiar silhouette, the dark outline of the winter cabin. Just a few dozen steps. "I'll make it," he mumbled. His voice was hoarse, almost foreign. He swayed, took one step, then another. The she-wolf didn't retreat. She rose, the cubs stirred, and the small pack moved with him. First cautiously, then more confidently. The blizzard was retreating, but in his heart a storm still raged. William walked forward, feeling how this strange companionship was changing the very essence of his solitude. Consciousness returned in fits and starts, sometimes as unclear sounds, sometimes as trembling that penetrated to the bone, sometimes in vague images resembling dream fragments. William felt his lips moving, but no words came out. Only a hoarse sigh, mixed with frosty air. The first thing that reached him was the movement of air near his cheek. He seemed to feel not wind touching his face, but someone's breath. Thick, warm, smelling of dampness and ash. Then, a barely audible squeak, like a puppy's voice, and quiet growling that resembled more a warning than a threat. Carefully opening his eyes, he saw a gray shadow above him. The she-wolf stood very close. The snow curtain of the blizzard framed her silhouette, making her look like a ghost from old tales. In her eyes glowed a yellow spark, wild, alien, but strangely not full of malice. She looked warily, ready at any moment to retreat or attack, but for now remained nearby. Beside her, 3 small lumps were stirring. Wolf cubs, still clumsy, with large paws and broad heads. They behaved differently. Curiosity pushed them forward toward the incomprehensible prone creature. One took several steps and poked its nose into William's jacket sleeve. The second whimpered and immediately hid behind its mother's paw. "Lord," William exhaled barely audibly, moving his weathered lips. The she-wolf pricked up her ears, growled, and the cub jumped back. But she herself didn't leave. Her breath again touched the man's face. And in this breath was something maternal, as if checking. Was he still alive? William tried to move. His arms responded with pain, his legs cramped. In his chest, his heart thudded dully. He attempted to sit up, but collapsed back into the snow. The she-wolf stepped back and growled louder. The cubs pressed closer to her sides. In that moment, human and beast looked at each other. William saw in her eyes not only wariness, but shadow of doubt. Before her was an enemy, a human, but at the same time, a helpless creature, as weak as her children could be. The blizzard gradually subsided, and in breaks between clouds appeared the full moon. Rays fell silver on the snow, highlighting every spark of frost. The forest froze, not a single bird's cry, not a single branch crack, as if the wilderness itself was watching this encounter, holding its breath. William tried not to make sudden movements. He understood that this moment might determine not only his night, but his entire remaining life. Slowly, he raised his hand, reached for the nearest pile of snow, took a handful and brought it to his lips, trying to quench his parched throat. The she-wolf didn't move. Her eyes followed his every movement. The cubs squeaked again, but she made them quiet with a short growl. "Don't be afraid," William whispered hoarsely. Of course, the beast didn't understand words, but the intonation, low, soft, she caught. The she-wolf pressed her ears back, relaxed briefly, then tensed up warily again. He knew he couldn't stay on the snow longer. His body would cool quickly, and even the warmth of animal breath wouldn't be enough. Somewhere to the side loomed the cabin roof, no more than 50 steps. Usually he covered this distance in a couple of minutes, but now it seemed like kilometers. Rising to one knee, he looked around. The she-wolf moved with her cubs, as if shielding them with her body. She wasn't attacking, but wasn't leaving either. In her eyes now appeared something new, hesitation. Gathering his remaining strength, William took the first step. Snow crunched. He swayed, grabbed the nearest spruce branch, and stayed upright. The second step was even harder. His legs trembled, every muscle screamed. But ahead the cherished door was visible, and this poured a trickle of courage into his weary soul. The she-wolf and her children moved after him. At first this alarmed him, but after several steps he understood. They weren't pursuing him as prey. Rather, they stayed close, as if they themselves feared something and sought protection from this unexpected neighbor. The cabin door opened with difficulty, but William finally jerked the frozen handle, and it gave way. Inside it was dark, deadly cold, but still the walls and roof meant at least some protection. He took one step inside, then another, collapsed on the bunk and coughed. The door remained ajar. In the moonlight, he saw silhouettes at the threshold, the she-wolf and 3 cubs. They didn't dare cross the boundary of human dwelling, but they weren't leaving immediately either. They stood and watched. William, no longer able to fight exhaustion, lowered his head and passed out. He woke to the sound of careful stepping somewhere nearby. At first he thought it was a dream, but no. In the semi-darkness of the cabin, lit by barely glowing coals in the fireplace, she stood there, the she-wolf. Her cubs were shuffling at the very door, whimpering pitifully. Alarm and fear battled with exhaustion and a strange sense of trust. He understood. If he struck out, she would attack in return. But in the beast's eyes he saw something else. Not malice, not hunger, but determination. She seemed to be listening to his breathing, evaluating whether he would survive. William closed his eyes and understood. This night the boundary between human and beast had become thin as an ice crust on a spring river. William woke from pain. It seemed every muscle in his body had turned into a separate heavy stone. His arms barely obeyed, his head pounded as if hammers were striking inside it. There was no warmth in the cabin. The fire had long since died, and the air inside seemed no warmer than outside. He tried to sit up, but from weakness collapsed back onto the bunk. Sparks danced before his eyes, breathing became ragged, and suddenly he felt something alive moving nearby. For a second, William froze. Everything inside instantly tensed. Adrenaline rushed through his veins. His eyes adjusted to the darkness, and he saw the familiar silhouette, the she-wolf. She stood very close, too close for a wild animal to say this was chance. There was no snarl on her muzzle, only tension and vigilance. Behind her paws, 3 shadows swayed, younger ones, cubs that cowered and at the same time greedily inhaled the human scent. William understood. This night would be decisive. The beast sat right by his bed. He heard her breathing, the dry, cold scent of fur, pierced with forest, resin, Then, the smell of blood she had probably procured somewhere for the cubs. But the strange thing in this breathing was that it warmed the air. He felt how from the icy emptiness in the room, a small island of life was born. The she-wolf lay down nearby, not right next to the human, but so that warmth from her body gradually penetrated the space. One cub grew bold and approached his feet. William struggled to raise his hand and didn't understand himself why he did it. Maybe he wanted to convince himself this wasn't a dream. Maybe because for so many years he had touched no one. And the very thought of the warmth of another's body, even in animals, tore through his loneliness. The cub flinched but didn't run. William barely touched its fur with his mitten. This sensation pierced him like a spark. Soft, yielding fur, living breath. He closed his eyes. Distant pictures surfaced in his memory. His son, still small, pressing against him on a frosty walk. His wife, putting her hand on his shoulder when she left for work in the warm school building while he prepared again for forest patrol. These memories always brought pain because returning them was impossible. But now the pain merged with warmth, and this made it easier. "Thank you," William said almost soundlessly, not knowing himself whom he was thanking. The she-wolf or the forest itself that had sent her on his path. Meanwhile, the animals acted as instinct commanded. The she-wolf embraced the cubs with her muzzle and pulled them closer to herself, simultaneously remaining on guard. Her ears barely moved, catching every creak in the wilderness, every crack. She knew. Cold retreated only for a moment, but danger was always near. The human remained a stranger to her, but a weakened stranger, and this made him safe for her young ones. She chose to stay. By dawn, William no longer shivered so violently. The warmth of the beast stabilized his body better than any rough sheepskin clothing. Gathering strength, he somehow rose and, leaning on the wall, reached the stove. Their dry wood waited, split, stacked by himself beforehand. He stuck in kindling a match, and fire blazed up. Fire came alive in the hearth, with crackling, sparks, golden tongues reflecting in the beast's eyes. The she-wolf started, exhaled loudly, but didn't run. The cubs, on the contrary, watched the flame mesmerized. "Here it is, little ones," the ranger said. "Here's the real spirit of life. Here is warmth." He surprised himself by addressing the beasts as if they were children. But this was natural. In wilderness depths, where human faces nature alone, words are needed by the speaker himself, not the listener. The day passed heavily. The snowfall had stopped, but such fierce frost struck that every crack in the hut was blown through. William wrapped himself in his sheepskin coat, but felt illness approaching. His head buzzed, everything in his mouth was parched, his body ached. The she-wolf left. This became noticeable suddenly. Just recently he'd heard her breathing, then silence. Only the cubs remained by the threshold, curled in a ball. He opened the door and saw her tracks leading toward the river. At first fear stung his heart. She'd abandoned them. But a few hours later she returned. Blood was on her muzzle and paws prey. The beast didn't dare enter inside, but dropped a rabbit carcass near the cabin. William understood. This was brought not only for the cubs. She'd brought it for him too. All the next evening they shared the prey. The human built a fire, cooked stew. The she-wolf fed the young ones raw meat. This was a strange alliance, but exactly what kept them on the edge between life and death. "Well then, mother," the ranger said, carefully looking at the she-wolf. "We'll live together for now. You answer for yours, I for the fire." She didn't answer, but in her eyes was no longer the former sharp threat. That night the cold came again, but William was no longer afraid. He already knew the beast's breath would warm him this time too. Smoke lazily drifted along the cabin roof. rising in bluish streams into the frosty morning. The fire in the stove burned steadily, warmth gradually displacing the harsh cold that had settled in the walls over recent days. William sat by the hearth, stretching his hands toward the heat like an old man, listening to the crackling of resinous logs in the fire. This sound was for him the most faithful sign of life. Beyond the door, silence. But he knew they were there. The light whimpering of cubs, the careful footsteps of their mother. The she-wolf didn't hide, but neither did she hurry to cross the threshold of human dwelling. William cracked open the door. Beyond the snowdrifts, gray silhouettes were visible. The she-wolf sat directly in front of the cabin, her paws half buried in snow. Nearby, the cubs tumbled about, rolling over each other, trying to gnaw on dry branches. An amazing sight for the ranger. Wild beasts seemed to have settled in his yard. He watched more closely. The she-wolf monitored not only her playful children. Her ears constantly trembled, her muzzle turned now toward the forest, now toward the river. She sniffed the air on guard. This was her world, and she felt its every breath. "Some watchdog you are, mother," William said, barely audibly chuckling. He decided to bring them some food. He had a bit of bread left, dried fish, and most importantly, those pieces of rabbit meat she herself had brought. He cooked a hearty stew, fragrant with smoke and fat, set aside a portion in a wooden bowl, cooling it. He stepped onto the porch carefully. The blizzard had subsided. The frost had become crystalline. The light crunch of snow under his boots, and the whole family tensed. The she-wolf crouched slightly. The cubs darted to her paws. But instead of a weapon, the human held a bowl of food. He placed it on the snow and stepped back. "Take it," he said, not looking directly into her eyes. Long minutes passed with no movement. Then one cub took the first step. Its nose touched the bowl, rustled. The she-wolf growled but didn't attack. Finally, she herself cautiously approached, sniffed, and took a piece. She looked at the human, and this look was no longer the same, but different. Recognition that he too was part of this circle of warmth and food. The day passed quietly. William replenished the wood supply, cleared snow from the entrance, checked traps in the shed. The she-wolf stayed nearby, within sight. Her children sometimes ventured onto the porch, sometimes played at the forest edge. And for the first time he realized he wasn't so lonely. For years of life at the winter station, he'd grown used to talking only with himself. Now he felt the breath of another life nearby, and this gave him strength. That night the winds howled again. The blizzard arose and subsided in waves like ocean tides. William sat by the fire and saw how the door was ajar for draft. Through the crack, moonlight carved a strip and illuminated furry silhouettes at the threshold. The cubs curled into balls, pressed against their mother. The fire in the stove gave off a soft crackling. The she-wolf didn't leave. She occasionally glanced inside the cabin. William raised his hand, as if inviting, and whispered, "Come in, it's warmer here." He understood the barrier was great. A wild beast would never simply cross a human's threshold. But in this look was something new. Toward dawn, William woke to a sound. The other half of the door quietly creaked, and he saw the she-wolf had finally entered inside. She moved carefully, each paw stepping as if over invisible mines. The cubs, hiding behind her side, squeezed in after her. They stopped right by the stove and watched the fire, mesmerized. William didn't move. He only pretended to continue sleeping. Inside, everything compressed with apprehension, but his heart also beat with joy. Thus, for the first time, human and pack shared breath and warmth under one roof. Strangers, but temporarily united by one fire. Until dawn, they remained nearby. Firelight danced on the walls. The moon looked through the window, and in the cabin sounded the breathing of beasts and the breathing of one weary human. And for the first time in many years, William fell asleep without feeling truly alone. Light penetrated the narrow cabin windows in thin streams. Morning came quiet, frosty, but without blizzard. The forest seemed to exhale. After the wild nocturnal storms hung a strange, muffled silence. Even the birds gave no voice. All the wilderness listened, as if checking who had survived the sleepless, snowy night. William raised himself on the bunk and slowly sat up. His head spun, but not as severely as before. Sleep under the protection of flame and the presence of beasts had proven deeper and calmer than solitary dormant existence in blizzardy winter quarters. The sharpness of his gaze told him he was not alone. The she-wolf was still inside. She lay right by the stove, curled up, but her eyes were open. The cubs slept in a heap. One even let out a quiet, sleepy squeak, twitched a paw in his dream. "Well, what guests I have," William muttered. His voice, hoarse but soft, echoed through the small room. The she-wolf, hearing sounds, raised her head. Her amber eyes seemed to glide over him, checking what he intended to do next. Inside, William stirred a feeling. If they continued living so close, some order needed to be established. Even in the society of village dogs and cats, there existed understanding, sharing, observing boundaries. With the she-wolf, there would be their own diplomacy, forest diplomacy. He took bread, stale but still soft in the middle. Its smell was simple but filled with human warmth of labor. He retrieved a piece of dried fish, put this in a bowl, and stepped toward the door. The she-wolf tensed. William slowly, without sudden movements, went onto the porch, set the bowl in the snow, and returned to the house. He left the door ajar. Moments stretched. First cautious steps. Then, a light shadow slipped past the threshold. The she-wolf approached the bowl, sniffed, and, with one movement of her teeth, broke the fish apart. She offered a piece to the cubs, keeping little for herself. William watched. His heart beat with wary joy. This was a small sign. Her choice, not hostility, but coexistence. The day passed in labors. William dragged wood from under the shed, chopped it. His body still didn't obey as before, but work returned strength. He needed a fuel supply to survive the frosty nights. The she-wolf observed from a distance, sitting on the snow. She didn't interfere. The cubs, meanwhile, began exploring the yard, now jumping to the shed, now poking their noses into piles of wood chips. Sometimes they dared run closer to the human, but at each growl from Mother instantly rolled back. This was their forest diplomacy, a small game of balances. The human acknowledged their right to presence. The beast gave him, in return, security from other threats. In the evening, William cooked stew. In the pot over the fire floated pieces of dried fish, onions saved from autumn. The smell filled the cabin. He again shared a bowl with the she-wolf, but this time went further. He sat right on the porch, holding a bowl by him, and laid out a piece of bread before himself. "Well then, Mother, I have it established here, human style, to share a meal," he said. The she-wolf approached almost closely. Her eyes burned with attention and caution. She took meat from the bowl, stepped away one pace, but no longer with a growl, not with wary recoil, but calmly. The cubs immediately rushed to divide the crumbs. The broad, heavy silence of wilderness settled habitually on William's shoulders. But today in this silence was more not of loneliness, but of life. He smiled to himself. Lived to see it. Now I'm a diplomat among beasts. When it grew dark, a howl sounded in the forest, distant, drawn out, like a plea through the air. The she-wolf immediately lifted her head. Her eyes flashed with alarm. She answered with a low, muffled growl, and the cubs quickly darted behind her paws. William listened to this exchange. He understood a strange pack somewhere nearby. Their boundaries had intersected, and here he first felt that the alliance between him and this she-wolf might prove not only a miracle of salvation, but a source of new threat. Strangers would not approve her closeness to human. The night passed nervously. The she-wolf barely slept until dawn, constantly going outside, listening into the darkness. The cubs whimpered, but calmed near the human and fire warmth. William lay looking at the fireplace and thinking, indeed, were both beast and human capable of for the sake of children? And could their invisible diplomacy withstand the pressure of the real wilderness? This was the beginning of their future trial. An alliance, fragile as the crunch of frosty snow. Trust that held on the edge of instinct and humanity. The frosty freshness struck his face when William threw open the cabin door. The air was especially transparent, that crystalline frost when breath rings like glass. The sky above the pines was bluish. On the horizon, golden rays of the barely risen sun gleamed. After several days of endless snowfall and gloomy weather, morning felt like a miracle. Finally a clearing. William pulled on his boots, checked his sheepskin coat. His body ached, but some strength had returned. He knew he needed to go out, survey the surroundings. The forest doesn't forgive carelessness, especially after such storms. Snow could have blocked paths, tree roots disappeared under drifts, and game changed their routes. The she-wolf already waited at the threshold. Her children fussed nearby. She raised her head and shook snowflakes from her scruff. In her posture was felt decision to go together. "Well then, Mother, let's go check our territories," William said, closed the door, and stepped into the forest depths. Snow lay in high layers, in places so deep that feet struggled to get out of the drift. But gradually the familiar rhythm appeared. Step, crunch, inhale, exhale. The she-wolf walked nearby, slightly ahead like a scout. The cubs sometimes sank in snow to their ears, sometimes leaped up and ran in small bounds. Soon William noticed what he'd come out for. Tracks. On fresh snow, not yet covered by wind, hoofprints showed clearly. Moose or deer had passed this night. He crouched, looked closely. "Moose," he muttered. "A big one." Nearby stretched another chain, light round with claws. "Fox." And here, slightly aside, ptarmigan paws and a trail leading into forest thickness. All the wilderness lay around, marked with animal writing. Hunter's knowledge told him. The blizzard had cleared the earth, and now every trail was visible clearly, as if on the palm of a hand. The she-wolf also studied tracks. She drew in air, pressed her ears, warily slipped her muzzle along the moose trail. But she wasn't following the beast. Her attention was directed toward where other tracks went, large, heavy, with characteristic claw extension. William tensed sharply. These prints he'd seen many times, wolf. Not cubs playing nearby, and not her paws. A pack, a real adult pack near. He froze, looked around. The she-wolf also tensed, fur on her scruff rose. She quietly growled, warning the children to stay closer. The cubs darted behind her paws. William felt his heart begin to pound. He understood. Their small alliance might soon be tested. If the pack encountered human and she-wolf together, the outcome unpredictable. For wolves, human is enemy. For this she-wolf, he'd become temporary comrade in warmth. But a pack wouldn't accept foreign loss. He ran a hand through his beard, as always when thinking. "So that's how it is. Hold on, Mother. We'll have to be on guard now." Further, they went along the river bend. Ice on it was solid, but in some places dark water broke through the white sheet. Frost drew intricate patterns along the bank. William stopped, listened. From under ice came babbling. Even these sounds brought hope. Water was alive. That meant spring would come, no matter how winter raged. On the return path, he again saw many tracks. A squirrel had crossed over drifts. A rabbit trail led to bushes. But most troubling were signs of the wolf pack crossing his path. They led toward the ridge and returned to the very forest edge. The she-wolf didn't leave his side by even a step. Her behavior was clear. She understood the threat and now stayed closer to human than to forest. Returning to the cabin, William built up the fire, hung mittens to dry. The she-wolf sat opposite. Her cubs lay in heaps. And for the first time he felt this strange coupling, human and beast, now stood not as enemies before wilderness, but as allies. He and she stood back to back, surrounded by the loneliness of blizzards and hidden danger. Unexpectedly, his hand fell by itself on the axe handle, an old, habitual movement. But then he released it. No, mother, if we defend ourselves, it'll be only with fire and our breath. He knew trials lay ahead, but now, among patterns of fresh snow and domestic warmth of the stove, a quiet pause had arisen. Snow outside the window sparkled in rays of pale sun. The wilderness lay in wait. The tracks left during the day remained an invisible map of future events, and William felt exactly along these tracks fate would lead them further. The evening came ominously. The frost hadn't abated. Wind tore snow flakes from drifts, hurled them at cabin walls, howled in cracks like someone outside was trying to enter. William sat on the bunk, listening to these voices and feeling the night would be long. The she-wolf was nervous. She kept jumping up, pacing from threshold to window, raising her muzzle and drawing in air. The cubs whined, pressed against each other. Fire burned in the stove, but this warmth seemed insufficient. Not to the body, but to the soul. Beyond the walls, something lurked. And then it sounded. Howling. Close, sharp, confident. The pack was approaching. Not distant calling as before, but clear approach. William rose. Pain slashed through his chest, but he still took the axe and a log from the woodpile. He said quietly, "Well then, mother, time to hold together." His words seared the silence. The she-wolf answered with a growl. She stood at the door, fur bristling, tail extended. Her gaze was fixed on the forest. The first silhouette appeared among trees. A dark spot slipped between pines. Then another. Wolves approached cautiously, but not hiding. The moon lit their gray pelts. The pack drew near. William knew wolf behavior. They don't rush into frontal attack. They circle, frighten, exhaust. But they fear only one thing, fire. He went outside. Snow crunched underfoot. He lit a fire before the cabin. Flames soared, crackled with resinous branches, sparked into sky. 2 more torches he placed at yard edges. A small triangle of light surrounded them. The she-wolf remained nearby. Cubs in the cabin, under wall and stove protection. He glanced. She'd entrusted him with her children. This was a sign stronger than any agreement. The pack emerged almost to the very light. Yellow sparks glowed in their eyes. A dozen wolves, strong, lean from winter, but confident. Their breath steamed over snow. One of them howled, harshly, commandingly. His voice sounded like an order. In response, several other howls drew out notes. A chorus of wildness demanding submission. The she-wolf raised her muzzle to sky and didn't answer. She growled low, shortly. Not a call, but rejection. William felt a cold lump in his chest. She had chosen. She stayed here, with him and the children. The first wolf stepped closer and stopped. Fire drove him back. The second crouched on snow, entering the semicircle. The pack was taking them in a ring, testing defense strength. William threw wood on the fire, raised another log, and lit it. The torch blazed, smoky, snarling. He spun it before himself. Flame tongues cut through darkness. Wolves retreated a step. "Here's our trial, Mother," he said, his voice sounding firm. They stood so all night. Each time fires weakened, William ran out, added wood. Ice on eyebrows and mustache gripped him. His head spun from weakness, but he didn't surrender. Nearby stood the she-wolf. She didn't rush into the pack, understood the futility. But her growls, her gaze kept strangers at distance. By dawn the pack withdrew, whether from exhaustion or recognizing the strength of the fire-defended position. The wolves faded back into forest depths. Only tracks and snow remained. Circling the cabin like signatures of a siege survived. William collapsed by the dying fire, every muscle screaming. The she-wolf approached, sniffed his face, then lay beside him. For the first time, she positioned herself as protector rather than protected. They had passed the test. Human and wolf, united by flame and mutual choice. Cold morning met William with sharp ache in his bones. Sleep had been intermittent, sometimes dozing, sometimes waking from cough and fever in his chest. Winter was taking its toll. The past fall and the blizzard and night and snow couldn't pass without trace. He understood illness had already settled inside, and now each day became a struggle for strength. He rose from under rough wool and looked at the floorboards. There the cubs still lay in balls, sleeping sweetly. The she-wolf kept watch at the door, her fur silvered with frost. She noticed his movement, pricked her ears, and turned her head slightly. A silent check. Was he alive? William shook his head, as if answering the unspoken question. The whole day proved long and difficult. He had little bread left, remnants of dried fish, and a couple pieces of meat from that very prey the she-wolf had brought. He went to the storehouse, checked sacks. Almost no supplies remained. Blizzard and illness had disrupted his schedule. He couldn't hunt, didn't go for wood to the distant clearing, didn't set new traps. He sat on the bench and stared into the fire. Thoughts circled around one thing. If he didn't replenish food supplies, they would all find themselves on the brink. By midday, the she-wolf left, leaving cubs near the cabin. William listened to the forest silently. In the quiet, every crack was audible, as if the forest was revealing its secrets. An hour passed, another. Finally, in the dusk, a silhouette appeared at the threshold. Her fur sparkled with frost, teeth gripped a rabbit carcass. She had brought prey. With surprise and gratitude, he watched her place it right at the porch. Cubs rushed forward. She looked at William, a hard, direct gaze, and in it clearly read, "We sustain you, but sustain us too." William went outside. He took the carcass, dressed it with his knife. Part he left for the wolves, part dragged into the cabin. In the pot water boiled, he threw in meat, added salt, from his cache poured a handful of grain. The resulting stew smelled of heated stove, of life. "Thank you, Mother," he said aloud. In the evening he tried again to walk the old trail, but his legs immediately weakened. Several steps, and his head spun. He had to lean on trees. Weakness was such that each step echoed with heaviness in his chest. The distant road to the village was now impossible for him. He returned to the cabin almost crawling, wrapped in his sheepskin coat, feeling his helplessness. That night, when crackling frost brought millions of stars above the wilderness, he admitted to himself, "Alone I won't make it." And this thought didn't seem shameful. It sounded like simple truth. Cubs pressed against his boots, sniffed the fabric. The she-wolf lay nearby, not interfering, but carefully watching they didn't cross boundaries. He sat by the fire and felt how their breathing and presence also became his resource. Not a store of food or wood, but a source of inner strength. The broken path to people was now obvious. He wouldn't reach them alone, but he had another direction, forward, where the wilderness itself called, together with this pack. And for the first time, this thought didn't frighten him. Night proved unusually clear. After heavy snowfalls and gloomy days, skies seemed to open above wilderness. Moon hung high and enormous, its cold light pouring glassy radiance over white expanses. Snow sparkled with millions of sparks, and all the forest resembled a crystal ocean. William sat at the cabin threshold, wrapped in old sheepskin. Inside, fire smoldered, smoke drifted in thin stream upward. He looked at sky, and his thoughts were viscous and clear. Body ached, breathing wheezed, but soul felt some festivity in this silence. Nearby, in darkness, lay the she-wolf. Cubs had quieted at her paws, curled warm sides together. All around was calm, and suddenly silence was pierced by voice. Distant, drawn-out howling. It arose somewhere beyond ridges, first quiet, almost indistinguishable, then growing. The voice was taut, full of strength and longing, and seemed to break straight into night's very heart. William started, so bright and commanding it was. This wasn't a lone beast, this was pack voice. The she-wolf raised her head. Her ears pricked, eyes gleamed with moon reflection. For a moment she froze, then stretched her neck and answered. Her howl was different, lower, softer, but also containing power. Cubs raised heads and squeaked with thin voices, imitating mother. It was strange for human to be in this chorus. Something ancient, forgotten rose inside him. Sound, drawn out and full of longing, seemed to touch strings of human soul. How many years ago had his ancestors, such village people, heard the same howling somewhere beyond settlement and felt that human and beast were linked by common fate of night? "You call yours," William said quietly, "and I call no one. Only forest listens to me." But inside he felt this exchange was their connection. Response came again. Howling echoed from another slope. William's heart grew cold. This meant pack was close. They circled here, around, sensing scent. And among this scent, they would find human scent. He looked at the she-wolf. Her fur stood on end, teeth slightly bared. She stood between cabin and night forest, like guard. Her cubs hid by the wall, and she herself answered, howling full height, as if declaring. Here was her land, her offspring. William slowly rose. Each joint responded with pain, but he went to the fire and added wood. Flames soared higher. Fire and wilderness, protection, word and weapon. He stood nearby, feeling how flame warmed him and lit snow. And then their gazes met, beast and human. She looked hard, but also as if with recognition. They were united by one thing. Both understood pack might come. William took out old axe, checked the head. Cartridges and rifle were few. He regretted using them needlessly. But he knew wolves feared firelight. If they came, defense was possible only with ring of flame. The she-wolf stepped closer. She didn't growl or attack. She simply stood nearby, as if her fate now also depended on fire and human. All night, they listened to voices. Sometimes it seemed they approached, sometimes went distant. Cubs trembled, huddled in circle. William threw branches on fire, understanding. While flame burned, they had chances. Closer to dawn, wind stilled. Last howl was distant, melted in pre-dawn haze. The she-wolf lowered to snow and breathed deeply. Pack had gone, for some time. "See, mother, we held," William exhaled. "But this is only beginning." Sun rose, painting pines with pink light. Weary Ranger felt trembling through his whole body, but inside, quiet determination. Now, they were truly together. Pack and she-wolf, human and beast. On this land, their fates were woven in knot that even frost wouldn't untie. New morning brought clarity. Sky was almost cloudless. Sun reflected in clean snow sheets, so brightly eyes were blinded. Everything seemed calm, but William felt anxiety. Two obvious pack presents had left trace that went nowhere. He sat by stove, breaking off piece of stale bread. His hand trembled. The she-wolf lay near door, her eyes carefully following his every movement. Cub slept, but sometimes woke and stretched noses toward stew scent. William lowered gaze to iron pot. Water in it boiled slowly. There, several meat pieces and handful of grain. Modest food, almost empty. He thoughtfully stirred, then poured himself bowl. But not bringing spoon to mouth, stopped. He understood. He would have to share. He pushed bowl away from himself, took deep breath, and, hiding weakness, nodded toward door. The she-wolf rose, approached closer. Her gaze was direct, predatory, but not hostile. He took wooden cup, poured stew there, and placed right at threshold. First cub rushed a bowl, poked nose, burned himself, jumped back. The she-wolf approached, took small meat piece, and laid it before cubs. Left tiny morsel for herself. William, watching, quietly smiled and said, "Well, such diplomacy we have, mother. I bread, you hunting. Together we hold life." The longer they shared food and warmth, the more boundary dissolved, but also thinner it became. William began noticing that each time he raised hand too quickly, she-wolf tensed. Each cough of his echoed with wariness. He understood this was still beast, and her trust, unstable bridge over abyss. An evening he took out old photograph from pocket. His son, still boy, stood beside him near fishing boat. Son smiled, glowed with life. William looked at picture and thought. So many years passed, yet everything remains inside, as if that cold day was yesterday. He turned to she-wolf. She watched strictly, as if understanding this paper scrap was important to him. He smiled and said, "You have children. I had them, and this were alike." That night anxiety came again. Distant sounded howling, but not so close as past night. The she-wolf raised head didn't answer, simply laid cubs closer to wall, between herself and human. This gesture seemed amazing to William. She entrusted guard not only to fire, but to him. He said quietly into darkness, "Don't fear. I'll stand for them too." That night, he slept little. Fever returned, sometimes threw in a heat, sometimes into chill. He felt himself on boundary, between sleep and wake, life and death. And in these half-awake thoughts, it seemed to him that between him and she-wolf occurred silent conversation. She asked, "Won't you betray?" And he answered, "No. While alive, won't betray." By dawn, blizzard rose again. Wind howled so that walls shuddered. William sat by fire, added last wood, and watched how outside flakes madly stuffed into cracks. He knew their life hung by thread. Food and fuel supplies rapidly ending. The she-wolf raised head, looked straight in his eyes. And he understood. She also understood. Their alliance built not on strength, but on mutual weakness. Fragile boundaries, human and beast. And between them, only fire spark. Evening came anxiously. Frost didn't subside. Wind tore snow flakes from drifts, threw them at cabin walls, howled in cracks as if someone outside tried to enter. William sat on bunk, listened to these voices and felt. Night would be long. The she-wolf was nervous. She kept jumping up, walked from threshold to window, raised muzzle and drew air. Cubs whined, pressed together. Fire burned in stove, but this warmth seemed insufficient. Not to body, but soul. Beyond wall something was. And here it sounded. Howling. Close, sharp, confident. Pack approached. Not distant calling as earlier, but clear advance. William rose. Pain slashed chest, but he still took axe and log from wood pile. He said quietly, "Well, mother." Time came to hold together. His words burned silence. She-wolf answered with growl. She stood at door, fur-bristled tail stretched, her gaze fixed on forest. First silhouette showed among trees. Dark spots slipped between pines. Then another. Wolves approached carefully, but not hiding. Moon lit their gray hides. Pack drew near. William knew wolf ways. They don't rush frontal fight. They circle, frighten, exhaust. But they fear only one, fire. He went outside. Snow crunched underfoot. He lit fire before cabin. Flames soared, crackled with resinous branches, sparked to sky. 2 more torches placed at yard edges. Small light triangles surrounded them. She-wolf stayed nearby. Cubs in cabin, under wall, and stove watch. He glanced. She trusted him with children. This was sign stronger than any treaty. Pack came almost a very light. Yellow sparks glowed in eyes. Dozen wolves, strong, lean from winter, but sure. Their breath steamed over snow. One howled, hoarse, commanding. His voice sounded like order. In answer, several other howls stretched notes. Wildness chorus demanding submission. She-wolf raised muzzle to sky and didn't answer. She growled low, short. Not call, but rejection. William felt cold lump in chest. She chose. She stayed here with him and children. First wolf stepped closer and stopped. Fire drove back. Second crouched on snow, entering semicircle. Pack took in ring, tested defense strength. William threw it on fire, raised another log, and lit. Torch blazed, smoky, growling. He spun it before himself. Flame tongues cut darkness. Wolf stepped back. Here our test. Mother, he said, and voice sounded firm. This did so all night. Each time fires weakened, William ran out, added wood. Ice on brows and mustache gripped him. Head spun from weakness, but he didn't give up. Nearby stood She-wolf. She didn't rush at Pack, understood uselessness. But her growls, her gaze kept strangers at distance. Till dawn they held watch. Pack tested their defenses, but couldn't breach fire circle. One by one wolves melted back into forest depths. Only tracks remained in snow, circling cabin like siege marks. William fell by dying fire, muscles screaming. She-wolf approached, sniffed his face, lay beside. First time she took position as protector, not protected. They had passed trial. Human and wolf, united by flame and choice. Spring's first breath touched the wilderness like tentative fingers testing frozen ground. Ice began its reluctant retreat from stream edges, revealing patches of dark earth that steamed in morning sun. The snow, which had been their prison and protection through the long winter months, now showed signs of surrender. Wet, heavy, collapsing into itself with soft sighs that echoed through forest depths. William stood at the cabin threshold, breathing air that carried unfamiliar warmth. His body, ravaged by winter's assault and the lingering illness that had never quite left him, responded to spring's promise with mixture of relief and melancholy. He was alive, against all odds, despite the fever that had nearly claimed him twice, despite the nights when his breath came so shallow the she-wolf had pressed her warm muzzle to his chest, as if willing his heart to continue beating. He had survived. The she-wolf sat nearby, but her posture had changed. Where once she had positioned herself between her cubs and the world, now she faced outward toward forest depths that called with voices only she could hear. Her cubs, no longer the helpless balls of fur that had tumbled around his boots through winter's darkest days, stood nearly as tall as her shoulders. Their eyes held intelligence sharper than winter stars, and their bodies spoke of strength that would soon need wider territories than his small yard could provide. William understood what he had known was coming since first ice began its melt. The bond that had sustained them through winter's trial was loosening, not from lack of care, but from abundance of it. She had taught her young to survive by his fire, and now that same eternal wisdom told her they needed to learn survival in their own element, among their own kind. One morning, he woke to find only two cubs at the door. The largest, the bold one who had first touched his sleeve that night when death had stalked them both, was gone. William searched the snow-mud mixture around cabin, found tracks leading toward river, toward freedom. His heart clenched, but he nodded approval at empty air. Growing up, he said to She-Wolf, who watched him with golden eyes that seemed to hold both sorrow and pride. As they should, day by day the departures continued. Second cub vanished during afternoon when sun climbed high enough to promise summer's eventual return. Third lingered another week, then followed siblings into wilderness that sang spring songs older than human memory. She-Wolf stayed, but William saw her restlessness in way she paced yard perimeter, nose lifted to wind that carried sense of awakening earth, of game moving through forest in patterns winter had disrupted. Her duty to cubs was complete, but her duty to herself, to wolf nature that had been temporarily suspended by their winter alliance, that duty remained unfulfilled. "You need to go," William said one evening as they shared what might be their last meal together. Fire crackled in stove, but doors stood open to mild air that no longer threatened death. "They'll need their mother to teach them packways." She looked at him with expression that might have been understanding, might have been gratitude, might simply have been Wolf's acknowledgement of seasonal truth. When dawn came, she would follow her children into forest depths where human couldn't go, wouldn't survive, shouldn't try. That final night, William sat by dying fire and remembered winter's lessons. He had learned that survival wasn't conquest of wilderness, but negotiation with it. That warmth shared was warmth multiplied. That trust, once given between species, created bonds stronger than fear, but more fragile than spring ice. He had learned what his son might never understand, what his dead wife might have known instinctively. That love took forms beyond human recognition, and sometimes the greatest love was knowing when to let go. When morning light revealed empty dooryard, William wasn't surprised. Tracks led toward river, toward forest heart where wolf song echoed in distance. He followed them to edge of trees, then stopped. This was boundary he wouldn't cross. "Go well, mother," he whispered to wind that carried her scent away from him forever. Weeks later, when park rangers found him walking slowly but steadily along access road toward civilization, William McKenna carried story no one would quite believe. Winter had tested him beyond endurance and revealed strength he hadn't known he possessed. He would return to human world, would eventually tell simplified version of his survival to those who asked, would live quietly with memory of yellow eyes that had watched over his sleep. But sometimes, in evenings when spring wind carried wolf song across valleys, William would pause in whatever task occupied his hands and listen to voices that sang of wild places where trust could bloom between species, where warmth was currency more valuable than gold, where winter's hardship forged bonds that survived even necessary partings. He would listen and remember and know that somewhere in forest depths, She-Wolf ran with her grown cubs, teaching them lessons she had learned beside human fire. And in that knowledge, he found peace that warmed him through all seasons that followed.